Welcome to the mother of all talk shows, now on midweek as well as on Sunday. Thanks to our good friend Ravi, our chief sponsor this evening and one of two sponsors from next week. Without Ravi, we wouldn't be here on a Wednesday night. And you no longer have to donate after this week because we're only sponsored for the first hour this week. We need your donations on the super chat and on the website, but next week we'll be fully sponsored and no longer require your exceedingly generous help. What a night. I thought that the main subject tonight would be the war in Ukraine, which is intensifying and perhaps about to move into a decisive phase. But the collapse of the British government, which is up to its neck in the Ukraine war, in fact, much beyond its neck, right over its mouth and nose and drowning its own people because of its involvement in the Ukraine war, is now itself expiring in real time. I thought that it might be possible that the government would fall by the time that we came off air this evening. I'm waiting for a word in my ear that the government has fallen at the beginning of the mother of all talk shows. Let's try and recap. Liz Truss sacked her Chancellor of the Exchequer. For overseas viewers, that's the second most important position in the government, the next door neighbour of the British Prime Minister, who lives at number 10, the Chancellor at number 11, interconnecting doorways in each other's ear all the time. And the reason, proximate reason, for the downfall of Kwasi Kwarteng, no need to remember how to pronounce his name. You'll never hear anything about him again. He only lasted 38 days in office. And the proximate reason was that he had introduced a mini budget which the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, at the time of my speaking to you, didn't like the policies that he outlined in that mini budget, which was unusual because he must have told her what was going to be in the mini budget. Even more unusual because what was in the mini budget was precisely what Liz Truss had campaigned to become Prime Minister on. Now Kwasi Kwarteng is out. A zombie called Jeremy Hunt, I have to say that very carefully, has been retreaded for a third time and is now the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Problem is, his political views on everything are diametrically opposed to his boss next door. It's going to make for interesting interconnected door conversations as long as Liz Truss remains at number 10, which must now be a matter of hours, perhaps days, but definitely not weeks. That was the big story midweek. Then, this afternoon, in advance of a confidence motion, that is to say, if the government had lost it, they would have gone to the country in a general election, which of course concentrates the minds of Conservative MPs considerably, as hundreds of them are currently scheduled to lose those seats in a general election. It was the ultimate gun at the head of Conservative MPs not to ban fracking, which the Conservatives, having promised in the general election they would ban, now want to resurrect, even though it will bring fire through a kitchen tap or a bathroom shower somewhere near you, at least on the basis of current science. So the Tories' U-turn on fracking was highly problematic for some Conservative MPs because they ran for office in their constituencies where fracking was a clear and present danger and promised their electors that there would never be any fracking on their doorstep. And how were they going to get re-elected if they U-turned on that and the flames started coming out of people's water faucets, as you call them? in the United States. Controversial, yes, but nobody expected what happened next. The Home Secretary, that's the Interior Secretary, the person in charge of everything that happens inside the borders of the British state, and perhaps, though not certainly, just outside in the English Channel, where the Home Secretary was under great pressure to stop the boats bringing hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people, every day across the English Channel from war-torn France, where they were in fear of persecution and perhaps death. Not. They were climbing into dinghies under the gaze of the French security forces and sailing across the Channel, and when they land, courtesy of all British institutions, from the Royal Navy to the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, they're whisked away, not to jail, not to a camp, but to a 4-star hotel, increasingly near you, and put up at £80 per night per person for an indeterminate period, almost certain to last for years. The Home Secretary wanted to stop that. Her name is Suella Braverman, KC as they call them now, King's Counsel, formerly Queen's Counsel, a young woman who, as the name suggests, is rather bold and even frisky. She wanted to do something about immigration in Britain. But Liz Truss, who ran on that very platform, is a very different Liz Truss now. Effectively, Britain has a Conservative government now for which it hasn't voted. It voted for Boris Johnson and his amanuensis, about whom more later, whose departure led to the beginning of the end for Boris Johnson, and now has a Conservative government that looks almost the diametric opposite, politically speaking. It's liberal, it's Remainer, it's woke, it's soft, it wants more immigrants, not fewer, and it wants better relations with the European Union, not poorer. And it is absolutely in lockstep with both the United States and the European Union on all matters of foreign policy. So back to the lobbies in the House of Commons this evening, where Jacob Rees-Mogg, the member for the 19th century, was mobbed and scragged, as they say, in Britain's private schools by the hoi polloi from the Red Wall, which returned Conservative MPs during the 2019 general election under the leadership of Boris Johnson for the first time, sometimes for 100 years, sometimes for longer. The Red Wall MPs are utterly furious with Jacob Rees-Mogg and the state of things inside the Conservative Party. So poor Jacob got scragged, he got mobbed. They were cursing and swearing. I don't want to use the words, but think of F, think of off, think of every word you can say to a toff like him that would wound and hurt him. That's exactly what they were doing. And it all ended up with a very comfortable Conservative government win, 96 votes of a majority, even better than their notional parliamentary majority. So you wonder what all the fuss was about, especially as it's now cost the jobs of both the Chief Whip and the Deputy Chief Whip. And as I gave you in the breaking news right at the beginning, a man called Grant Shapps is now the Home Secretary. I have to check, because he's had 3 names in the time he's been in Parliament. Yes, he's a man with multiple identities, and he's now in charge of Britain's police force. He's a man that had to change his name, so dodgy were his business activities. He's a man that falsely represented himself as called one thing when he was actually called something else, who ran a kind of Ponzi scheme that promised you that you would get rich if only you followed his advice. But because that's not how it worked out, he had to change his name. And he's now the British Home Secretary. At least he was at the time I started to speak. My phone is on. I'm ready, Liz. If you'll give me the Foreign Secretaryship with plenipotentiary powers to end the war, to recognize Palestine, to sail an independent course for the British state, to make up with China and Russia and Iran and Venezuela and all the other countries that you have gratuitously offended over the last 12 years now of Conservative government, I'm prepared to take the job. But I'm not going to give up the mother of all talk shows, because I've got two cracking guests this evening. Gonzalo Lira from the front line in Ukraine. He's up right after this very short break.